Let me tell you something about silence. Out here in the shadow of the mountains, it's not the absence of sound, it's a presence. It's the weight of the wind before it howls, the held breath of the pines before they sway. You learn to read it same as you'd read a trail, but I was a fool. I thought I could read the silence in the Apache woman who ran the boarding house kitchen just as easily. I heard the clatter of pots, the hiss of the fire, the rhythmic chop of her knife. I saw the quiet, efficient dance of a woman who knew her work. I was so busy listening to the sounds of her labor, I completely missed the sound of her breaking. A man learns things in the mountains. He learns that the most dangerous trail isn't the one with the deepest chasm, but the one that looks just like the path home. He learns that a storm can build in a clear blue sky. Most of all, he learns that the quietest thing in the room is usually the most powerful and the most wounded. I hadn't been down from the high pastures in 6 months. My world was the smell of pine, the feel of good leather, and the company of my own thoughts. Her world was a small, hot kitchen, filled with the demands of strangers. I walked into it, a stranger myself, carrying the dust of the trail and the ignorance of a man who thought he'd seen it all. The air in the dining room was thick with the smell of frying bacon, wood smoke, and the low murmur of tired men. My hands, calloused and still gripping the ghost of my horse's reins, felt clumsy and out of place as I hung my hat on a peg by the door. I was just a rancher, looking for a hot meal and a soft bed, but what I found was a lesson in the silent languages of the heart. A lesson taught by the quiet cook, who I came to know only through the pain she tried so desperately to hide. Here is the story in 4 parts. My name is Elias Thorne, and for the better part of 20 years I've been a man who listens to the land. I know the crackle of a dry creek bed, the creak of a ponderosa pine in a high wind, the subtle shift of a stone that tells of a mountain lion passing through. I've learned to trust my gut more than my eyes, because out in the wild, what you don't see can kill you. But that morning, as I walked into the clattering, steamy world of the stagecoach stop's dining room, my gut was as useless as a town-bred fool on a spooked bronc. The stop was a low-slung, sod-roofed building, a necessary haven for travelers braving the pass before winter set in. Inside, it was a cacophony of sounds that felt almost violent after the serene quiet of the high country. A tinny piano in the corner was being tortured by a man with more enthusiasm than skill. The thump of glasses on the bar was a constant, percussive beat, and the air was a thick soup of whiskey, sweat, and frying meat. I'd been hired to drive a small herd of longhorns down to the valley for a man in Santa Fe, and I'd finished the job a week early, a rare gift of time I planned to spend in a real bed, eating food I hadn't had to cook over a smoky fire. A few days of civilization before the snows drove me back to my own small cabin. I found a corner table with a view of the room and sat down with a heavy sigh, my bones aching for rest. And that's when I first saw her. She moved through the chaos like a shadow with a purpose, a small woman with her dark, graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. She was bringing a steaming plate of stew and bread to a table of rowdy freighters, and she had a way of shifting her weight, her shoulder subtly angled to deflect a stray elbow. Her face was a mask of quiet efficiency, the kind of expression you see on people who have long ago learned that the best way to survive a storm is to simply keep walking through it. She didn't spare a glance for anyone, her eyes on her work. The men she served barely registered her presence, their conversations carrying on without a pause. They grunted their thanks or didn't bother at all, taking her service as a given, like the heat from the stove or the rough-hewn planks beneath their boots. To them, she was just the cook, the Apache woman who made the stew. She was invisible. But I was a man used to seeing. I noticed the small things. The way her hands, strong and sure, were covered in a lattice of tiny, faded scars, some white and puckered, others still faintly pink. I saw the slight tremor in her fingers as she set down a cup of coffee. I saw the way she would sometimes pause, just for a fraction of a second, and press her palm flat against her side, as if to stifle a pain that wasn't in her body but in her very soul. And I saw her eyes. They were the color of dark river stones, deep and opaque, but every now and then, when she thought no one was looking, A flash of something I could only describe as a deep, bottomless hurt would flicker in their depths. It was there and gone so fast, you'd miss it if you blinked. I was 2 days into my stay when I finally heard her speak, and it wasn't a word. It was a gasp. I'd come down for an early breakfast, before the freighters and the stagecoach passengers descended. The dining room was mercifully quiet. A fire crackled in the large stone hearth, and the only other sounds were the clink of my spoon against my bowl and the steady rhythm of a knife from the kitchen. The door to the kitchen was a simple wooden plank, hanging askew on leather hinges. Through the gap I could see her, standing at a large wooden block, mincing onions with a frightening economy of motion. The morning light slanted through a small, grimy window, illuminating the dust motes that danced around her. As I watched, she pressed her hand against her side again, but this time her whole body seemed to fold in on itself. The knife in her hand clattered onto the block, and a low, ragged sound escaped her lips. It was the sound of a creature that had been driven too far, its spirit finally betraying its flesh. It was a moan of pure, unadulterated pain. I was on my feet before I even thought about it, my chair scraping loudly on the plank floor. The sound startled her, and she whipped around, her eyes wide with a fear that was startling to see. For a moment, she looked less like a stoic cook and more like a trapped animal. "Ma'am," I said, my voice sounding rough and loud in the quiet room. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" Her face hardened instantly, the fear replaced by a defensive scowl. She straightened her back, but the movement was stiff, and I could see a sheen of sweat on her forehead. "I am fine," she said, her voice flat and her English heavily accented. She turned back to her work, picking up the knife with a resolute grip. "You should eat your breakfast." I knew better than to argue. A man learns quickly in this life that you don't push a person who's made up their mind to be strong, even when you can see them crumbling. I sat back down, my appetite suddenly gone. I ate my breakfast in silence, but I couldn't take my eyes off the crack in the door. I didn't sleep that night. The memory of her gasp, the raw pain and the sound replayed in my mind. It wasn't just any pain. It was the sound of a secret so heavy, so old, it had become a physical weight she could no longer carry. The image of her pressing her hand to her side, that quiet, defiant gesture, haunted me. It was a lie she was telling everyone, but more importantly, it was a lie she was telling herself. The next afternoon, I found myself on the back porch of the stop, cleaning the dust from my saddle. The wind had picked up, and the first bitter promise of winter was in the air. I heard the back door of the kitchen open and close softly. She was there, dumping a pail of potato peelings into a bin for the hogs. I knew I should stay quiet. I knew it wasn't my place. Back east in the genteel world I had fled years ago, you minded your own business. But out here in this hard land, sometimes a shared silence can be a greater comfort than a whole world of empty words. "It's a mean wind," I said, keeping my eyes on my saddle. She paused, her hand on the bucket. She didn't look at me. "It will bring snow soon," she replied, her voice barely audible over the wind. "You should be gone from here before it comes." "I don't have a pressing need to be anywhere," I said, with a lightness I didn't feel. I was trying to set a mood, one of casual conversation. "I find a good saddle is a better friend than most men I've met." She almost smiled. It was a flicker, a ghost of an expression that softened the hard lines around her mouth. "Then you have met the right horses," she said. For a fleeting moment, we were just two people exchanging pleasantries. Then she winced. It was the same instinctive gesture, her hand pressing flat against her left side. She tried to hide it, turning her body away from me, but I saw it. I saw the pain that seized her features before she masked it once more. "That pain," I said, my voice dropping low so as not to carry. "It's getting worse, isn't it?" She stiffened. The fragile bridge of connection we had formed crumbled in an instant. She turned her full gaze on me then, and it was the look of a woman who had been questioned one too many times. It was the look of a woman who had learned the hard way that questions often preceded a betrayal. "My pain is my own," she said, her voice cold as the coming frost. "It is not for you. You are a stranger, a guest in this house. What do you know?" "Nothing," I admitted. "I just the way you pressed your hand." "It is nothing," she snapped, her nostrils flaring. "I am an old woman, I work. Old women ache. It is the way of things." She turned and walked back to the kitchen, the door slamming shut with more force than was necessary. I stood there for a long time, the smell of horse and leather and the approaching snow filling my senses. I had overstepped. I had treated her like a problem to be solved, a trail to be read instead of a person who had earned the right to her own secrets. But I also knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I hadn't been wrong. That pain was a story, and it was a story that was slowly killing her. The next day the stagecoach arrived from the south, bringing a handful of passengers. One of them was a young woman, a schoolteacher named Miss Lydia Hayes, pale and breathless from the journey. She was full of nervous chatter, asking me about the mountains and the scenery as I helped her down from the coach. I pointed out the landmarks, the towering peaks to the west, the long, rolling valley we had just come from. I was playing the part of the helpful local, all the while my thoughts were on the woman in the kitchen. I found myself looking for her in the dining room that evening. She was working, her movements just as efficient, her face just as closed off. But I could see it now. I could see the toll it was taking. Her hands trembled more. The slight hunch in her shoulders had deepened. She moved with the careful, deliberate step of someone who is trying not to cause a fresh wave of agony. A man I knew from a neighboring settlement, a crude fellow named Hank, watched her work with a sneer. He'd had too much whiskey. "That squaw's got a sour look about her today," he said loudly to his companion. "Looks like she's chewing a wasp." His companion laughed. "Maybe she's got a bellyache from all the scraps she's been eating." The laughter was a sharp, ugly sound in the room. My jaw tightened. I saw the cook pause for a fraction of a second, her back still to the room. She had heard them. Of course she had. She heard everything. She then continued on her way, not acknowledging the remark, but I saw her hand, the one not carrying the tray, clench into a fist at her side. A righteous fury was building in me. I could have stood up and said something. I could have called the man out. But what would that have accomplished? It would have caused a scene, embarrassed her, and given these men an even greater reason to target her. I had to be smarter than that. I had to find another way. Later that night the winds had died down and the sky had cleared, revealing a magnificent tapestry of stars. The cold was sharp and brittle. I was on the porch again, trying to clear my mind. I heard the door creak open behind me. It was her. She was carrying a small mug of steaming coffee. She didn't say a word, just held it out to me. I took it, the warmth seeping into my cold fingers. It was a peace offering, a truce. She didn't have to say she was sorry for her sharp words the day before. She had said it through this simple act. "Thank you, ma'am," I said softly. She stood beside me, looking out at the stars. "In my stories," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, "the stars are our ancestors. They watch over us. They remember." "That's a fine thought," I said. "I like that." "They have seen much," she continued, her voice taking on a distant quality. "They have seen the wars, the running, the dying. They have seen the bobbies born in the cold and the old ones left behind." "They've seen too much," I said quietly, understanding that she was telling me something about herself without actually telling me. Her hand went to her side again. The motion was so automatic, so ingrained, it was like she had to assure herself the wound was still there. "Yes," she agreed, her voice full of a weary sadness. "They have seen too much." The next morning I asked the owner of the stop, a man named Mr. Pickering who never stepped foot in the kitchen, about her. "The cook," he said with a shrug. "Name, Sally. She's been here for, Lord, it must be 5 years now, came out of nowhere. Good worker, quiet, keeps her head down. That's the only way to survive with that kind of blood in this county, you know." "What's her story?" I pressed. "Where is she from?" Mr. Pickering just shrugged again. "No idea. She came, she cooked, we paid her. No questions asked. That's the arrangement." Sally, it was a white man's name, a name she'd probably taken to make her life easier. It hung there in the air, impersonal and wrong. She had a real name, a name her mother had given her, a name that probably meant something. And she was hiding it, hiding herself, just like she was hiding that pain in her side. It was a kind of murder, I realized, a slow, quiet murder of the spirit. And I was beginning to understand that the physical pain was just a symptom of a much deeper, more terrible sickness. A sickness that had its roots in a history of pain, loss, and silence. A history that the stars had witnessed. And I knew, with a growing sense of dread, that I was about to see the culmination of it all. It was Miss Hayes, the school teacher, who accidentally uncovered the first piece of the puzzle. 2 days after her arrival, a blizzard hit. It came howling down from the peaks, blanketing the world in a swirling, white fury that made the stagecoach stop an island in a sea of snow. All travel ceased. The dozen or so of us guests were stranded, forced into an uneasy familiarity with one another. We were a motley crew, freighters, a traveling salesman with a valise full of cheap jewelry, a taciturn gambler, the nervous schoolteacher, and me. The enforced proximity and the relentless howl of the storm did little to soothe anyone's temper. The whiskey flowed freely, and the men's conversations, once confined to their tables, grew louder and cruder, especially in the presence of Miss Hayes, who tried her best to ignore them. Sally, the cook, was unaffected by the storm or the boisterous clientele. She continued her work, the clatter of her kitchen a constant, grounding rhythm amidst the chaos of the storm and the men. She brought out food, cleared plates, and retreated back into her sanctuary, her face a mask of stoic indifference. But I was watching. I noticed that when the freighters would get particularly raucous, their crude jokes about the squaw and her cooking becoming more pointed, she would slow down. Her movements would become more deliberate, her breathing shallow. It was as if their words were physical blows, each one finding a weak spot in an old scar. She was, I realized, bracing herself, waiting for the storm of their abuse to pass just as she waited for the blizzard outside to pass. The storm raged for a full day and night. The roof groaned under the weight of the snow. The only warmth came from the fire, which we had to constantly stoke. The air in the dining room was thick with the smell of wet wool, wood smoke, and stale whiskey. Late on the second night, I found myself in the kitchen, helping to haul in an extra armload of firewood. Sally was there, preparing a late pot of coffee for the sleepless. She was kneading a lump of dough, her movements strong and even. The warmth of the room, the simple domesticity of the scene, was a stark contrast to the primal fury of the storm outside. "It's good to have a roof," I said, stamping the snow from my boots. "A man could freeze to death out there in a matter of hours." She grunted in agreement, not taking her eyes from her work. "The snow is not the worst thing," she said. "The cold is. The snow only buries you. The cold, it steals your breath. It makes you sleep." The words were simple, but they were delivered with the weight of personal experience. This wasn't speculation. It was a lesson learned in a place far more brutal than this warm, fragrant kitchen. I had a sudden, vivid image of her, a young woman, perhaps a child, huddled somewhere in the cold, trying not to sleep, trying not to let the cold win. The next morning the storm finally broke. The wind died down to a whisper, and the world outside was a pristine, blinding white. The sun, bright and deceptively warm, reflected off the snow, making the landscape look like something from a dream. The silence after the storm was profound, a stark, clean canvas waiting to be written on. Miss Hayes was the first one out the door, a sketchbook clutched in her hands. She'd been a prisoner in the stop for 2 days, and the sudden, open world seemed to call to her. She tramped around the building, her boots leaving deep holes in the fresh powder. "Mr. Thorne," she called out, her voice bright and clear in the crisp air. "Come see this. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." I went to join her. She was standing by the wall of the building, a part of the sod roof I hadn't noticed before. There, on the white, exposed side of an old, half-rotted root cellar door, was a series of carvings. They were deeply gouged into the wood, made with a sharp knife, their edges softened by time and weather. They weren't words, not in English anyway. They were symbols. A coyote howling at a crescent moon, a mountain lion stalking a deer, a circle with a line through it, a trail of tiny, delicate footprints leading to a small, crude representation of a child. Beside the child, another symbol, a small, simple cross like you'd see on a grave. The work was detailed, skilled, and brimming with a power that felt almost sacred. It was a story told in pictures, a history carved into the wood. "Who do you think did this?" Miss Hayes asked, her voice hushed with reverence. "It must have taken them days." "It's beautiful," I said, my eyes tracing the lines, but I didn't need to ask who. The answer was as clear as the sun on the snow. My mind flashed to the calloused, scarred hands of the cook. I remembered her saying the stars were the ancestors, that they remembered. This was her history. This was the truth she was hiding. Just then a sharp voice cut through the quiet. "What are you doing?" I turned. Sally was standing just outside the back door to the kitchen, a wooden spoon still clutched in her hand. Her face was pale, her dark eyes wide with not just anger but a raw, primal fear. It was the same look I'd seen the morning I heard her gasp. This time, it was 1,000 times more intense. Miss Hayes jumped back as if burned. I'm so sorry, Mrs. I was just admiring the carvings. I didn't mean to pry." "You have no right," Sally said, her voice trembling, the words coming out in a strangled whisper. She took a step forward, her eyes locked on the door, on the little child with the cross beside it. "This is not for you. It is private. It is my memory." The raw agony in her voice was unmistakable. It wasn't just the pain of being discovered. It was the pain of having a festering wound ripped open again. In that moment I understood. The stars on the mountain weren't just her ancestors. They were the witnesses to her tragedy. The child in the wood with the simple cross was the heart of her secret. "I'm sorry, ma'am," I said, putting myself between her and Miss Hayes. "We didn't mean to intrude. We were just taking in the view. We'll go back inside now." I placed a gentle but firm hand on Miss Hayes's elbow and steered her toward the door. As I passed Sally, I saw that her hand was pressed to her side again, but this time it was with a different kind of pressure, as if she was physically trying to hold herself together. The mask of stoicism was gone. Underneath was a landscape of grief, as vast and barren as the snow-covered plains. That evening, the whole place felt different. The men, oblivious to the drama of the morning, were still in high spirits. The stagecoach was due to arrive again the next day to take the passengers south, and they were celebrating their impending release. Hank, the crude freighter, was at his worst. He'd been drinking steadily for 3 days. "Hey, you," he bellowed as Sally passed by his table. "The new girl's been looking at you in a funny way, squaw. You teach her how to make that little cross out of twigs." A few of the men around him laughed nervously, but most looked away. I felt a knot of ice form in my stomach. He was toying with her. He was probing her weakness, and he knew exactly where to jab. Sally froze. Her face went slack. She didn't move, didn't speak for a full 10 seconds. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. Then something broke inside her. Her mask crumbled completely, and a wave of raw grief, so pure and powerful that it sucked the air out of the room, washed over her. A sound came out of her. It wasn't a scream. It was a wail, a keening, ancient sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. It was a sound of unbearable loss, a mother's cry for a child, a sound that echoed the primal grief of all mothers who have ever lost a child to violence or to the cold. It was the sound of her soul, howling for the child carved into the wood. The room went silent. The fire seemed to dim. Hank's bravado vanished, replaced by a look of horrified confusion. He was a bully, not a man prepared to face the genuine, shattering sorrow he had unleashed. Sally stood there, her body shaking with sobs, her face a mask of agony. Her hands were clenched at her sides. She was rocking back and forth, the wail subsiding into a series of choked, ragged breaths. Mi hij, she whispered over and over. It was Spanish, but the meaning was universal. Then she was running. She tore through the dining room, past the stunned faces, and out the back door, leaving the door swinging wildly on its hinges. The silence she left behind was deafening. I looked around the room. I saw the shock on the gambler's face. I saw the tears streaming down Miss Hayes's cheeks. I saw Hank looking at his hands at the table, anywhere but at the door. He had wanted to hurt her to get a rise out of her, but he hadn't expected this. None of us had. I was the first one to move. I threw my chair aside and ran after her. I didn't know what I was going to say. I didn't know what I could possibly do to help. I just knew I couldn't let her face that ancient, howling grief alone. I found her by the root cellar door, the one with the carvings. She was on her knees in the snow, her hands pressed flat against the wood, her forehead resting against the image of the child. She was still sobbing, her body racked with powerful, shuddering tremors. The snow was melting on her, soaking her dress. She was shivering violently, but she didn't seem to feel it. "Ma'am," I said softly, crouching down beside her. "Sally." She didn't respond. Her breath was coming in ragged gasps, and I could see her whole body was trembling from a combination of the cold and the overwhelming emotion. The wound she had been trying to hide was out in the open now, bleeding for all the world to see. "Please," I said, my voice breaking a little. "You'll freeze to death out here. Let me help you. Let me help you inside." Slowly she looked up at me. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face wet with tears and melting snow. She looked 100 years old. The fight was gone from her. There was only a raw, bottomless pit of sorrow. "Her name was Anna," she whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound. "She was 5. It was the first time she had spoken a truth about herself in 5 years. It was the first time she had let anyone see the person behind the mask. I gently took her arm. I know, let's get you warm, please." This time she didn't resist. She was too broken. I helped her to her feet, and she leaned heavily on me as we walked, her breath a painful rasp in the cold air. The silence of the mountains was the only witness. The stars were beginning to emerge from the clearing sky, and I knew they were watching, remembering, just as she had said. They had seen the little girl die, and now they were seeing a mother finally, after all these years, begin to mourn. I half carried her back into the kitchen. The warmth of the room hit us like a wave, and she shuddered violently. I sat her down on a small wooden stool by the cold stove. Miss Hayes, who had been waiting in the doorway, rushed to get a blanket. She draped it over Sally's shoulders, her own hands trembling. Sally didn't move. She just stared at the wood grain on the floor. Her eyes were empty, as if all the grief had poured out of her and left only a hollow shell. The rest of the men in the dining room were silent, the incident a stark, unwelcome interruption to their night of drinking. Hank had gone to his room, his tail between his legs. The bully had been beaten, not by a fist, but by a truth far bigger than him. I was at a loss. I've patched up 100 wounds on the trail. I've set broken bones, pulled bullets, and stitched up gashes from a grizzly's claws. But this was a different kind of wound, an invisible one that went far deeper than flesh and blood. I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't even know how to talk to her. Miss Hayes, to her credit, did the best thing she could. She knelt in front of Sally and took her cold, rough hands. "Tell us," she said softly. "Tell us about Anna. Don't carry it all by yourself anymore. Let us help you." There was a long, heavy silence. I could hear the tick of the old clock on the mantelpiece in the other room. I could hear the wind starting to pick up again outside. I started to think she wouldn't say anything, that she had retreated back into her fortress of silence. But then her gaze focused on Miss Hayes. The emptiness in her eyes flickered, replaced by a dull, distant spark. Her mouth opened, and a history of sorrow that she had held inside her for over a decade, began to spill out. Wasn't a pretty story. It was a hard, unflinching look at a life forged in violence. She told us she was a Chiricahua Apache born in the mountains of what was now New Mexico. She had been a young mother, a wife. Her name was not Sally. It was Nashel. Her husband, a proud warrior named Tajai, had been a leader in the resistance against the soldiers. They had never been part of a reservation. They had lived free in the traditional way of her people, moving with the seasons, hunting and gathering. Then the army came. She had been camped with her husband, his warriors, and a small band of women and children. They had been betrayed by a scout. The attack was swift and merciless. The soldiers, led by a colonel whose name she never forgot, fell upon them in the dawn mist. There was gunfire, screaming, the smell of blood and cordite. Her husband and most of the warriors were killed instantly, fighting to give the women and children time to run. She had grabbed her daughter Anna and fled into the rocks, carrying the terrified child in her arms, the echo of gunfire and the shouts of the soldiers pursuing them. She had found a small cave, a dark crevice in the granite, and she had hidden there for a day and a night with her daughter, clutching her, trying to stifle her sobs. She was so brave, Sally Nashel whispered, the tears streaming down her face. She did not cry, she was so still. She was a good girl, my Anna. She knew we had to be quiet. She knew the soldiers would find us if we made a sound. They had waited for what felt like an eternity. Then she heard the sound of horses. Not the steady, heavy tread of army mounts, but the soft footfalls of Apache ponies. It had to be some of the surviving warriors, returning to search for their families. She had crawled out of the cave, her legs numb, a hope so bright and desperate burning in her chest that she nearly wept. But the soldiers had doubled back. They had anticipated the rescue attempt. They had laid a trap. They had swept through the canyon, not with mercy but with fire. They were burning everything. The wickiups, the stores of food, the bodies of the fallen. The smoke was thick and acrid. It was a scene of utter devastation. She had decided to flee, to run for a different pass and hope to find other survivors. She had told Anna to be brave, that they would be safe soon. But Anna was so tired, so scared. She could barely keep up. In her panic, her fear for her daughter, she had made a mistake. She had left the safety of the rocks and tried to cut across a small clearing, a faster route to the new hiding place. She had been the one who had made them do it. She was the one who had insisted. In the smoke and the chaos, she hadn't seen the two soldiers on the ridge. They had seen the movement. A single shot had rung out. Anna had crumpled. The scream that had torn from her mother's throat was a sound that had been trapped inside her for 5 long years. She had run to her daughter, but it was too late. Anna was dead, a tiny pool of blood spreading beneath her. I could not stay, Nashel said, her voice a broken whisper. I could not stay and watch. I had to leave her there. I had to run. I am a coward. I left my daughter for the coyotes. No, I said, the word escaping me before I could stop it. No, you weren't a coward. You were a mother trying to survive. You had no choice. She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw a flicker of something, not forgiveness, but maybe a tiny shred of understanding. I survived, she said, the words dripping with bitterness. I ran, I hid. I walked for 3 days with no food, no water, until I found this place. They called it a sanctuary. They said I could cook. They said I could hide my face and my blood. For 5 years I have done that. I have been invisible. I have been Sally. She said the name like it was a curse. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The clatter of the dining room seemed a world away. I finally understood why the scars on her hands were so white, why the ache in her side never went away. It was the pain of carrying that grief, a physical weight she could never put down. That night I couldn't sleep. My cabin in the mountains seemed like a distant dream. I was drawn back to the root cellar door. I had to see the carvings again, to see them with the new understanding I now had. The moon was almost full, casting the snow-covered ground in an ethereal silver light. The carvings on the wood seemed to glow. I traced the image of the coyote. I followed the little footprints to the child. I understood now. The trail of footprints was her own flight. The coyote was her people. The child was Anna. Then I saw the cross, which I had mistaken for a simple grave marker. But now I saw something else. Below it, etched with a careful, trembling hand, was a small, crooked addition. It was a rectangle like a marker, and on it were 5 tiny, crooked lines. It was her name, Anna. She had come out here night after night, maybe in the dead of winter or under the blazing summer sun, and she had carved this tribute to her daughter. It was a secret shrine, a place where she could come and be the woman she truly was. Nashel, the mother of Anna. A crushing weight of melancholy settled over me. I thought of all the lonely nights I'd spent in my cabin, the quiet company of my horses and my thoughts. It had seemed like a peaceful existence. Now, it felt like a shallow, self-centered one compared to the lonely, agonizing vigil this woman had kept. The next morning I decided to do something. It was foolish, impulsive, and probably the wrong thing to do, but I had to try. I went to the livery stable, saddled my horse, and rode out into the snow. I was looking for something. I didn't know what. A wild flower maybe, or a special stone. A sign that the land itself was offering its condolences. I just wanted to bring her something, anything, to show her that she wasn't alone. I rode for miles, the only sound the crunch of my horse's hooves in the snow and the whisper of the wind. The landscape was stark and beautiful, a world of white and blue. I didn't find a flower. I found a small, beautiful cluster of quartz crystals, shot through with a deep, rusty red gleaming in the sun. It looked like it was crying. It was perfect. When I returned, I didn't go inside. I went to the back porch and knocked on the kitchen door. Nashel answered, her face a mask of tired, enduring pain. She was working again, the noble drudge, but the fire in her eyes was gone. She looked like a ghost going through the motions. "This is for you," I said, holding out the crystal. "I found it up on the ridge. It looked like it was a stone that had cried for 1,000 years. I thought your ancestors might be watching over it." She stared at the stone for a long moment. Then her hand, shaking slightly, reached out and took it. She turned it over in her palm, the red streaks catching the light. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just looked at it, a piece of the world she had lost, offered to her by a stranger. "Teshi," she whispered, a word in her own tongue. I didn't ask what it meant. I didn't need to, I knew. For the first time, I saw a tiny crack in the wall of her grief. She looked up at me, her dark eyes meeting mine. There was no anger in them, no fear, just a deep, aching gratitude that seemed to wrap itself around my heart. That evening, a little before dinner, I heard the faint sound of a woman singing from the kitchen. It was a soft, lonesome song, in a language I didn't understand. The melody was beautiful and sad, like the wind through the pines. It was the first time I had heard a sound of life from her that wasn't a sound of work or pain. It was a tiny, fragile song of hope, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. The peace it brought me was shattered by the arrival of the stagecoach that day. In the hustle and bustle of the new passengers, a man stepped out who was different from the others. He was older, with a weathered face and the bearing of a military man. He saw me and said, "Is the owner here? I need to ask him about a woman. An Apache cook I heard was working here." My blood went cold. I knew, with a dreadful certainty, that this was the man from her story. I saw the way he carried himself. The same arrogant posture, the cold blue eyes that the colonel in her tale must have had. And in his hand, he held a faded, yellowed photograph. It was the face of a young woman in a simple white dress, and I knew it was her. The memory of the wife she had been before she became Sally. The world narrowed to the point of that photograph. It was a ghost from her past, a spectral image of the woman she had been before the war, before the running, before Anna. The contrast between that composed, hopeful young face and the hollow-eyed, grief-stricken woman I'd seen in the kitchen was a knife to the heart. The man, I'll call him Colonel Treadwell, didn't see me at first. He was too busy surveying the place, a look of professional disdain on his face for the lowly sod house. His eyes landed on Mr. Pickering, the owner. "You," he barked. "I'm looking for an Apache woman. Goes by Sally now, but her real name is Nashel. She'd be about 50 now, I suppose. Used to be married to a renegade leader. You got her here." My hands were shaking. I felt a primal protective instinct surge through me, a fury so hot and white it threatened to boil over. This man was a hunter and he had come for his prey, not for justice, just for sport. He wanted to collect a trophy to satisfy some ancient, corrupt vendetta. I couldn't let him near her. I had to give her time. I had to do something. Before Mr. Pickering could answer, I stepped forward, putting myself in the colonel's path. "You're looking for an Apache woman," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "What business do you have with her?" He looked at me with the same dismissive glance he'd given the building. "Business of the state, friend. She's a fugitive. She was part of a renegade band that ambushed a supply wagon, killed a few of my men. I've been tracking her for years." It was a lie. I knew it was a lie. He was the one who had attacked her camp. He was the one who had killed her husband. He was the one who had caused the death of her daughter. He had the gall to come here, to stand in her sanctuary and call her a criminal. "I don't believe you," I said, my voice trembling with a barely contained rage. "I think you're a liar and a murderer, and I won't let you near her." He laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You'll let me? Who the hell are you? A cowboy trying to play the hero?" He reached for his sidearm. It was a deliberate theatrical movement meant to intimidate. "You're interfering with a manhunt. Step aside or I'll put you down like a dog." The room fell silent. The other passengers and the freighters had stopped their conversations, their eyes fixed on us. The air was thick with tension. I was terrified. I was not a fighter. I was a rancher, a man of the mountains. But I also knew that if I let him take her, I would never be able to live with myself. I had seen her wail. I had seen her break. I had seen the spirit of a woman who had survived so much, only to be hunted again. I couldn't let him win. "You won't put down anyone," I said, my voice low and steady, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "You're in my house now. You're a guest, and you're threatening a member of my family." It was a gamble, but it paid off. He paused, his hand on his gun. He looked around the room at the faces of the men who were now watching him with suspicion. He was a bully, just like Hank. He had expected an easy victory, a frightened woman he could drag away in chains. He hadn't expected a fight. Before he could make a move, the back door of the kitchen swung open. It was Nashel. She had heard everything. The look on her face wasn't fear. It was a cold, implacable fury. It was the look of a woman who had been pushed to the edge of the abyss and had found the strength to fight back. "You," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. She pointed at him, her hand steady. "You killed my husband. You burned our home. You murdered my daughter. And you dare come here to the place where I have mourned her and call me a fugitive." The colonel was taken aback. He hadn't expected this. He'd expected a cowering, broken squaw, not a woman of steel and fire. "I was acting on orders," he said, trying to regain his composure. "It was a war. I was following orders. The woman was collateral damage." "No," she snapped. "There was no war. There was only slaughter. You did not kill my daughter on a battlefield. You killed her because you were too arrogant to let her go. You killed her because I was your enemy and she was mine." Tears were streaming down her face, but her eyes were blazing. She took a step toward him. "My little girl is dead. My people are gone. I have nothing left but the memory of her, but I will not let you take that memory. I will not let you take my grief and turn it into a trophy for your monstrous pride." The colonel was visibly shaken. He was a man who had spent his life being feared, and he wasn't used to being confronted by someone who had nothing left to lose. He looked around the room, searching for a way out, for a way to save face. "Mr. Pickering," he said, turning to the owner, "I'm placing this woman under arrest. I'll need a horse and a room for the night." But Mr. Pickering, who had been silent and trembling through the entire exchange, finally found his voice. He looked at the colonel, then at Nashel, then at me. He looked terrified, but he was a man of business, and he knew a losing proposition when he saw one. "I'm afraid I can't help you, sir," he said, his voice shaky. "This is a free territory. I don't have any jurisdiction over personal grievances, and the lady is a valued employee." It was the bravest thing I'd ever seen him do. He was siding with the woman who had cooked his meals for 5 years against the man with the gun and the badge. The colonel was furious. He sputtered for a moment, then realized he had lost. He had no authority here. He was just a bitter, angry old man, drowning in his own hatred. He looked at me, his eyes filled with pure venom. "This isn't over," he snarled. "There are laws where I come from. You're harboring a fugitive. There will be consequences." Then he turned on his heel and strode out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The silence he left behind was overwhelming. Everyone was staring at us. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Nashel was trembling, her face pale. She looked at me, her eyes wide with shock and something else. Was it fear? Relief? I couldn't tell. I just knew she was in danger. He would be back. He might come with more men with real authority. She wasn't safe here anymore. The next few hours were a blur. I talked to Mr. Pickering, who was terrified but refused to back down. I talked to Miss Hayes, who promised to do what she could to help. But the most important conversation was the one I had with Nashel, alone on the back porch, under the cold, watchful stars. "You need to run," I said. "Tonight, now, he won't give up. He'll be back with more men." "I have run my whole life," she said, her voice empty. "I have no home, I have no people. Where am I to go?" "With me," I said, the words coming out before I could think. "There's a place, high in the mountains, a small cabin I have. No one knows about it, it's safe. No one will find you there." She stared at me. The stars were reflected in her dark eyes. "You would do this for a stranger." "You're not a stranger, Nashel," I said, using her real name for the first time. "I've seen your heart, I've seen your spirit, and I've seen you survive. You're stronger than any man I know. You deserve a place to be at peace." The tears were falling freely now. She looked at the stars, at the moon, at the vast, silent mountains. "I am afraid," she whispered. "I am so afraid. I am tired of running. I am tired of hiding." "I know," I said, my voice thick. "I know, but you can rest now. You can be Nashel again. You can mourn Anna. You can just be." It was a promise I had no right to make. I was just a rancher, but I meant it with every fiber of my being. We left that night under the cover of darkness. I had packed my few belongings and gathered the 2 best horses we had in the stable. She didn't have much. A small bundle of clothes, a worn piece of jewelry, and the quartz crystal I had given her. She took the root cellar door with her. I don't know how she did it, but she had pried it from its hinges and carried it with her, the carvings of her history, her pain, and her love. The ride was silent and long. The only sounds were the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the whisper of the wind through the pines. The cold was biting, but I didn't feel it. I was focused on the journey, on getting her to safety. We arrived at my cabin just as the first light of dawn was breaking over the peaks. It was a small, simple structure, built of logs and chinked with mud, but it was sturdy and warm. A fire was already lit, crackling in the hearth. I led her inside. She stood in the middle of the room, looking around at the simple furnishings, a bed, a table, a few worn-out books. She looked like a ghost in the morning light. She placed the root cellar door gently against the wall, the image of Anna the first thing she would see when she woke. "This is your home," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's our home now," I said, "if you want it to be." She looked at me, her eyes searching mine. She had been betrayed by the world, by people, by fate itself. She had every right to be suspicious. But in my face, she saw only the truth. I was not a hunter. I was a man who had found his purpose, and his purpose was her. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She took a step toward me, and then another, until she was close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her. She reached up and touched my face, her hand cold and calloused, but her touch was gentle, like the first snowfall of winter. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you do this for me?" I didn't have a grand answer. I didn't have a clever speech. I had only the truth, and it was simple and raw. "Because in a world that was so cruel to you," I said, my voice thick with emotion, It's the least I can do." She leaned her forehead against my chest and I wrapped my arms around her. We stood there in the quiet of the cabin, the first rays of the rising sun spilling through the window, illuminating the carvings on the door. The coyote howling at the moon, the mountain lion, the trail of footprints, and the little girl, Anna, forever safe in her mother's memory. In that moment, I understood what I had been missing. All those years in the mountains, I had been searching for something. I just hadn't known what it was. I had been searching for a connection, a purpose, a way to make a difference in a world that often felt cold and indifferent. I had found it in the quiet cook who kept her pain secret, and in the truth that mountain had finally revealed. The sun rose higher, chasing away the shadows. The snow on the mountain sparkled like diamonds. The world was beautiful and harsh, and in the silence of the cabin, a new story was beginning. A story of two lonely souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of places, and the healing they would find in the quiet of the mountains. The years that followed were not easy. There were moments of sadness, days when the ghost of Anna would haunt the cabin and Nashel would retreat into her grief, singing her lonesome song. The fear of the colonel never quite left us. We heard whispers of a man asking questions in town, but he never found us. But there were also moments of profound beauty. I learned her real name. I learned her history. I learned the secrets of the mountains from her, the stories her people had told for generations. I taught her English, and she taught me Apache. She taught me about the roots and the berries, the medicinal plants that grew in the high meadows. She taught me how to see the world not as a place to be conquered, but as a home to be cherished. And one spring, when the wildflowers were in bloom, she took me by the hand and led me to a small, sunlit clearing high above the cabin. There, nestled between two ancient pines, was a small mound of stones. On the largest stone, she had carved a single beautiful symbol, the image of a little girl dancing with the coyote. It was Anna's final resting place, a place of peace and memory. She turned to me, her eyes full of a deep, abiding love that had slowly replaced the grief. "My story is here," she said, placing a hand over her heart, "with you." And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that her journey was over. She had finally found her home. The wind rustled through the pines, carrying with it the scent of pine and wildflowers. It was a quiet, perfect moment, a moment of peace that had been forged in the crucible of immense pain. It wasn't a happy ending, not in the way they write in books. It was a real ending, full of quiet resilience, profound love, and the deep, abiding peace that comes from finally being known.